We live in the most comfortable age in history, and yet people are more anxious, fragile, and lost than ever. We avoid conflict, we soften our opinions, we design our lives to remove all friction. But here's the silent truth. Comfort isn't protecting us. It's slowly making us stressed and anxious. And that raises a dangerous question. What if the things we call toxic are the very things that make life worth living? As we dive in tonight, I'd love to know something simple. What time is it where you are in the world right now? And where do you listen to these stories? In a comfortable chair, under the weight of your blankets, or somewhere else? Personally, I enjoy listening to sleep podcasts in bed or while traveling. Long before therapy was a fad, before self-help books, before morning routines became a personality type, there was a man who believed that comfort is not a reward. He believed it is a sedative. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the traits we now call toxic, solitude, arrogance, indifference, emotional restraint, self-responsibility, disobedience, renouncing comfort, confrontation, were often the very forces that made life deeply meaningful. And in modern day, psychology has uncovered a secret benefit of discomfort and challenge. They're calling it post-traumatic growth. Studies found that meaning, not happiness, is what makes suffering bearable. That discomfort, under the right conditions, doesn't break us. It rewires and transforms us. Nietzsche learned this the hard way. His life was very comfortable. He was the youngest, most successful, highest-paid professor. Yet he suffered greatly. He was eventually criticized, shunned by his co-workers and peers, essentially cancelled. He was plagued with health issues, extreme loneliness that came from being rejected for his beliefs, and a long list of other ailments that eventually caused his mind to break. Within that suffering, he developed controversial ideas so forbidden that they were ignored, misunderstood, and declared harmful to society. But instead of escaping this discomfort, he sat with it. He observed it carefully, patiently, as though the pain itself had something to teach him. Tonight, we'll explore exactly what he learned from that quiet suffering. The philosophies that emerged from his journey have the power to woke the world up. Forgive me. Wake the world up. And as you drift off to sleep, you may slowly begin to realize what toxic traits may actually be your superpower. Welcome, nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that will reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. The air in the office was thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Dust lay on the dried leather book bindings that had not been opened in years. Friedrich Nietzsche sat behind a heavy oak desk at the University of Basel, a desk most men would have killed for. At just 34 years old, he had achieved what was meant to be a lifetime destination. The youngest professor in the university's history, tenure, a respected title, a future that promised stability, recognition, and comfort until death, a life that asked for nothing more than obedience. But as he stared down at the letter in front of him, his vision swam. The words bled into one another, as they so often did now. His temples throbbed with that familiar pressure, the kind that made thought itself feel like a physical burden. The pain was constant, relentless, not sharp enough to scream, but heavy enough to exhaust the will. This wasn't a passing illness. It was his constant companion, severe migraines. And this letter sitting in front of him was not friendly, not welcome. It was a verdict. His latest work had been mocked in faculty rooms and open correspondence alike. Too weird, too dangerous, not real scholarship. This was an academic execution. The same men who once praised his brilliance now avoided his gaze in the corridors. Lecture halls that had once been filled with curiosity now echoed with absence. Doors closed softly. Conversations ended abruptly. He wasn't just sick. He was, in the modern sense, cancelled. Nietzsche leaned back slightly in his chair, closing his eyes. Behind his eyelids came the familiar storm. Memories, questions, fragments of sentences that refused to settle. So this is how it ends, he thought. Not with an argument, but with silence. Most people in this position, perhaps even you, would have apologized. They would have softened their opinions to win back the herd. They would have clung to the paycheck and the title, even if it meant suffocating their soul and their beliefs for comfort. They would have apologized, even if it meant lying to themselves. And for a moment, the temptation passed through him. Just a quiet suggestion. You could stay. You could endure. You could survive. He looked around the room again. The shelves, the desk, the window that framed the Rhine beyond the city, all of it suddenly felt hollow. He understood then, with an unsettling clarity, what they were offering him was not true help. It was comfort. And comfort, he had come to believe, was the most dangerous sedative ever administered to the human spirit. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the office keys resting against his palm. Those keys represented safety, income, belonging. They also represented silence, a silence that would require him to betray his own thoughts, slowly, professionally, politely, until there was nothing left but a title and an empty mind. His hand tightened. The decision did not arrive like courage. It arrived like inevitability. Nietzsche stood. The chair scraped softly against the wooden floor. The sound felt louder than it should have been, as if the room itself was listening. He placed the letter back on the desk, set the keys beside it, and walked out. The winter air struck his face with a sharp honesty that made his eyes water. The cold did not ask permission. It did not soften itself to be tolerable. It simply was. Each step away from the university gates sent a tremor through his body, feverish, unsteady, half-blind. Yet something inside him felt strangely lighter. He had no steady income, no permanent home, no institution left to shelter him. Only his pain, his thoughts, and the long road ahead. Ahead waited a decade of wandering. Isolation so complete, it would strip him of every borrowed identity. It would either break his mind or force him to build a new life. Tonight we gently explore why he walked away from the safety, and why, if you feel trapped inside a life that looks stable but feels hollow, Nietzsche's most dangerous ideas and philosophy may not be your threat, but your escape. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, then share your favorite episode that might help a friend. Tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers and let the next story find you when you need it most. Rocken was the kind of village where nothing ever happened. A tiny dot in Prussian Saxony, near Leipzig, where the most exciting weekly event was Sunday church service. Into this religious stillness, on October 15th, 1844, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was the Lutheran pastor, a gentle, pious man who took his duties seriously and raised his son to do the same. The household was suffused with faith, not the comfortable social faith of people who attend church out of habit, but the deep, bone-level conviction that every moment mattered to God, that salvation hung in the balance, that righteousness was the only path worth walking. Little Friedrich absorbed it all. He memorized Bible verses before he could read properly. He listened to his father's sermons with the intensity of a much older child. Other boys called him the little pastor because of how seriously he took religious matters. He would correct other children's blasphemies, pray with fervent concentration, and speak about God with an earnestness that made adults smile and other children roll their eyes. He seemed destined for the clergy, a good, obedient son who would follow in his father's footsteps. And then, when Friedrich was 4 years old, his father began to die. It started with headaches. Then came seizures. Then hallucinations. Carl Ludwig Nietzsche, the upright pastor, descended into what doctors called softening of the brain, likely a brain tumor, though diagnosis in 1849 was more art than science. For a year, the household watched him deteriorate. The man who had preached about God's mercy and eternal life became a babbling, convulsing shadow of himself. Friedrich watched it all, absorbed every moment of his father's agony. In July 1849, Carl Ludwig died screaming. Friedrich was not quite 5 years old. 6 months later, his 2-year-old brother, Ludwig Joseph, also died. The boy was left in a house of women, his mother Franziska, his younger sister Elizabeth, his grandmother and 2 aunts. 5 women dressed in black, mourning, praying, trying to make sense of God's plan. But here's what nobody talks about in polite biographies. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy truly began. Not in university lecture halls, not in scholarly debates, but in this moment. A 4-year-old boy watching his father, the representative of God on earth, die in agony while prayers went unanswered. Watching his baby brother follow shortly after. Watching the women who raised him explain it all away with talk of divine will and heavenly reunion and mysterious purposes beyond human understanding. Something in young Friedrich's mind began to ask a question he wouldn't fully articulate for decades. What if they're lying? Not to me, to themselves. Years later, he would write about how we create comforting stories to make suffering bearable. How we invent afterlives and divine plans and cosmic justice because the alternative, that suffering is meaningless, that death is final, that there is no grand purpose, is too terrifying to face. But for now, he was just a boy trying to be good in a house full of grief. The family moved to Naumburg, a slightly larger town where they could live with extended family. Friedrich was enrolled in a good school. He excelled at everything: languages, music, writing, theology. He was the kind of student teachers love. Diligent, brilliant, respectful. He composed music, wrote poetry, produced an autobiography at age 14, because of course he did. The child was nothing if not precocious. His early writings were full of religious devotion, classical references, and the kind of earnestness that makes you want to pat him on the head and tell him to lighten up. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. At 15, he began writing essays that questioned, carefully, respectfully, but definitely questioned, some aspects of Christian doctrine. Nothing too radical, just thoughtful, probing. The kind of questions a very smart boy asks when he's actually thinking about what he's been taught, instead of just accepting it. His family didn't notice, or didn't want to notice. He was still going to church, still praying, still on track for a respectable career in theology or philology. And then, at 20 years old, Nietzsche wrote a letter to his sister Elizabeth that would mark the point of no return. The letter was dated June 1865. Friedrich was at the University of Leipzig, studying philology, the interpretation of classical texts. He had already made a name for himself as a brilliant student. His professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, called him the most talented student he'd seen in 40 years of teaching. But Friedrich was wrestling with something his professor couldn't help with: faith. Elizabeth, his younger sister, was deeply religious. She wrote to him constantly about God's love, about the importance of maintaining their father's legacy, about staying true to the faith that had sustained their family through tragedy. And Friedrich, unable to keep lying, wrote back with devastating honesty. The letter begins kindly enough, acknowledging her love and concern. But then comes the blade. Hence the ways of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. He was telling his beloved sister that she had to choose comfort or truth. You can't have both. He continued, faith does not offer the least support for a proof of objective truth. Here the ways of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't youthful rebellion or intellectual posturing. This was Friedrich Nietzsche making a choice that would define his entire life. He would pursue truth wherever it led, regardless of the cost to his comfort or his place in society. Elizabeth was devastated. She begged him to reconsider. Their mother worried about his soul. Family friends whispered that the boy was heading down a dangerous path. But Friedrich had crossed his Rubicon. He had spent 15 years absorbing Christianity, another 5 years questioning it, and now he was done. Not with anger or bitterness, at least not yet, but with the calm clarity of someone who has solved a difficult equation and arrived at an unwelcome answer. Christianity, he was beginning to believe, wasn't just false. It was a magnificent lie that humanity told itself to make suffering bearable. It promised an afterlife to compensate for this life's pain. It preached meekness and forgiveness and turning the other cheek, values that Nietzsche was starting to suspect, kept people weak, submissive, and easy to control. This insight didn't arrive all at once. It would take years to fully articulate. But the seeds were planted in that letter to Elizabeth, in his father's suffering, in his growing realization that the stories we tell about God and morality might be symptoms of something deeper, our fear of life itself. Still, he kept quiet publicly. He continued his studies. He was brilliant at philology. So brilliant that in 1869, at just 24 years old, he was offered a professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Think about that. 24 years old, no doctorate yet. And he was offered a full professorship at a prestigious university on the strength of his intellect alone. His Professor Ritschl's recommendation letter read, "He will simply be able to do anything he wants to do." Prophetic words. Though perhaps Ritschl didn't realize just how dangerous Nietzsche's ambitions would become. But before we get to Basel, before we get to his mature philosophy, we need to understand how a sickly scholar who could barely see became one of the most influential thinkers in history. Because Nietzsche's greatest weapon wasn't his mind. It was his willingness to suffer for truth, and suffer he did. Here's what the romantic biographies skip over. Friedrich Nietzsche spent most of his adult life in excruciating pain. headaches that lasted for days, vision so poor he could barely read, nausea that left him bedridden, stomach problems that made eating a gamble, insomnia that turned nights into torture chambers of racing thoughts and physical agony. It started in his 20s and never really stopped. Some scholars speculate he contracted syphilis during his brief military service in 1867 to 1868. Others think it was a combination of bad genes, poor health habits, and the long-term effects of dysentery and diphtheria he caught during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, where he served as a medical orderly. The cause didn't matter. The result was the same. Nietzsche's body was at war with his mind. Most people, faced with chronic illness, find religion. They pray for healing. They search for meaning in their suffering. They tell themselves God has a plan. Nietzsche went the opposite direction. His suffering became his laboratory. His pain became his teacher. Every headache, every sleepless night, every moment when his body screamed at him to stop thinking and just rest, these became opportunities to test his ideas about strength, endurance, and what it means to be human. He wrote some of his most famous ideas during his worst episodes. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger wasn't motivational poster wisdom for Nietzsche. It was a description of his daily reality. At Basel, he tried to be a normal professor. He taught classes on Greek philology. He attended faculty meetings. He graded papers. But he was also writing. And what he was writing had nothing to do with dry academic analysis of ancient texts. In 1872, he published The Birth of Tragedy, a book that was supposed to be about ancient Greek drama, but was really about something much more dangerous: the nature of existence itself. The book argued that Greek culture thrived on a tension between two forces: the Apollonian, order, reason, clarity, and the Dionysian, chaos, passion, destruction. Modern life, Nietzsche argued, had suppressed the Dionysian, had become too rational, too ordered, too safe. We needed to reclaim the wild, destructive creative force that makes life worth living. His academic colleagues hated it. This wasn't philology. This was philosophy, and bad philosophy at that. Too poetic, too passionate, too damn weird. His career as a serious academic was essentially over before it began. But something else was brewing. Something that would change his life in ways he couldn't predict. He had become friends with Richard Wagner, the great composer. Or rather, Nietzsche had become Wagner's disciple. He worshipped the older man, saw in Wagner's operas the rebirth of that Dionysian spirit he craved. Wagner, for his part, enjoyed having a brilliant young admirer. He invited Nietzsche to his home, introduced him to his wife Cosima, treated him like a protégé. For a few years, Nietzsche was as close to happy as he'd ever been. He had a mentor. He had a purpose. He was part of something larger than himself. But happiness for Nietzsche was always temporary, because the more time he spent with Wagner, the more he saw behind the curtain. Wagner wasn't a Dionysian revolutionary. He was a self-promoting artist who craved applause and money. His operas, Nietzsche began to realize, weren't resurrections of Greek tragedy. They were comfortable entertainment for the bourgeoisie, dressed up in mythological costumes. Worse, Wagner's anti-Semitism, which Nietzsche had initially overlooked, became impossible to ignore. Wagner's German nationalism, his appeal to blood and soil, his embrace of Christianity in his later works, all of it repulsed Nietzsche. The break came slowly, painfully. By the mid-1870s, Nietzsche stopped visiting. He stopped writing adoring letters. He started writing scathing critiques instead. Wagner never forgave him. Neither did Cosima. And Nietzsche, who had few friends to begin with, found himself even more isolated. In 1879, his health collapsed completely. The headaches became unbearable. His vision deteriorated to the point where he could barely read for more than an hour without agonizing pain. The university gave him a small pension, and he resigned from teaching. At 34 years old, Friedrich Nietzsche's academic career was over. His friendship with Wagner was destroyed. His health was ruined. He had no steady income, no home, no close friends beyond a handful of correspondents. Most people would give up, find a quiet corner, live out their days in comfortable obscurity. But Nietzsche did something else entirely. He began to wonder. For the next decade, Nietzsche lived like a ghost moving through Europe's resort towns and mountain villages. Nice, Sils Maria, Genoa, Turin, Rome, Venice. He never stayed anywhere long. A few months here, a summer there, always searching for climate that would ease his headaches, always fleeing when the weather turned. He travelled light. A few changes of clothes, his notebooks, his barely functional eyes shielded by dark glasses, his massive moustache, which, let's be honest, was probably his most distinctive feature, becoming a symbol of the strange German man who kept to himself. He wrote. God, did he write? Despite the pain, despite barely being able to see, despite having to dictate to friends when his eyes failed completely, Nietzsche produced an astonishing body of work during these wandering years. Human, All Too Human in 1878. Daybreak in 1881. The Gay Science in 1882. These weren't academic treatises. They were collections of aphorisms, short, sharp observations that hit like punches. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. That which is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. He was developing his mature philosophy, one short burst at a time. And the central idea was starting to crystallize. Everything we call morality, everything we've been taught about good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice, is not natural or universal or handed down by God. It's made up, created by humans for very specific human purposes, and not always good purposes. This is where Nietzsche's idea of slave morality comes from, though we'll explore that more deeply later. For now, what matters is that he was dismantling every comfortable certainty Western civilization had built over 2 millennia. Christianity wasn't just wrong. It was a psychological trick that weak people played on strong people. Compassion wasn't noble. It was often a disguise for resentment. Truth wasn't something to worship. It was just another human construct. Can you imagine how lonely this made him? Every letter he sent to the few friends he still had was full of his latest insights, his newest attacks on conventional thinking. And almost nobody understood. They thought he was being provocative for attention, or that chronic pain had made him bitter, or that he was losing his mind. Maybe all three were a little bit true. But then, in 1882, something happened that would crack open Nietzsche's philosophy in a completely new way. He fell in love. Her name was Lou Salome. She was 21 years old, Russian, brilliant, unconventional, and the first woman who ever made Nietzsche feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone in the world. They met in Rome in April 1882, introduced by a mutual friend named Paul Ray, who was also in love with Lou, naturally, because nothing in Nietzsche's life could ever be simple. Nietzsche saw her and apparently his first words were, "From which stars have we fallen to meet each other here?" Lou's response, "I simply came from Zurich." That should have told him everything he needed to know. Lou Salome did not swoon. She did not play the romantic ingenue. She was there to study philosophy, to meet interesting thinkers, to live life on her own terms. But Nietzsche, who had spent his entire adult life locked in his own head, who had never had a serious romantic relationship, who had been isolated by illness and philosophy, and his own impossible standards, Nietzsche fell hard. He couldn't express it directly, though. He was too awkward, too German, too wrapped up in his own inability to be vulnerable. So he did what shy intellectuals have done throughout history. He asked his friend Paul Ray to propose to Lou on his behalf. Yes, really. The philosopher who would write about the will to power couldn't ask a woman out himself. Lou said no. Nietzsche tried again. This time he proposed directly during a walk in Lucerne. She said no again. But here's the beautiful, terrible thing. Lou didn't reject him entirely. She wanted to be friends, more than friends, intellectual companions. She suggested they form a kind of philosophical commune, living together platonically with Lou's mother as chaperone, to study and discuss ideas. For a brief moment, Nietzsche thought he'd found it. Someone who understood him. Someone who could match his intellect. Someone who might make the loneliness bearable. They spent the summer of 1882 together. Nietzsche, Lou, and Ray, talking philosophy, taking long walks, debating ideas. There's a famous photograph from this period. Lou sitting in a cart holding a whip, with Nietzsche and Ray harnessed to it like draft animals. It was meant to be playful, ironic. Years later, people would use that photo to paint Lou as some kind of manipulative femme fatale. But that's bullshit. Lou was honest about what she wanted. Friendship and intellectual exchange. It was Nietzsche and Ray who wanted more and couldn't accept that she didn't. Things got complicated. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who had always been possessive of her brother, hated Lou instantly. She spread rumors. She wrote poison pen letters to Lou's mother, suggesting Lou was manipulating both men. She did everything she could to sabotage the relationship, and it worked. By autumn, the whole situation had collapsed. Lou and Ray went to Berlin together. They would remain close friends for years, though never romantically involved. Nietzsche was left behind, isolated, rejected, and furious. His letters from this period are painful to read. He called Lou a dried, dirty, smelly little monkey with fake breasts. He raged about her dishonesty. Though she'd never actually been dishonest, he just hadn't wanted to hear what she was actually saying. For a man who prided himself on strength, on amor fati, loving one's fate, on saying yes to life, this rejection broke something in him. Most people would have been crushed, would have given up on philosophy and love and everything else. But here's the thing about Nietzsche. He knew how to turn poison into medicine. In the depths of his despair over Lou, isolated in the mountains of Sils Maria, Switzerland, Nietzsche began writing what would become his masterpiece, the book that would define his philosophy and secure his place in history. He called it Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unlike anything else in philosophy. It's not an argument. It's a prose poem, a gospel for a godless age, a myth about a prophet who comes down from the mountains to teach humanity how to overcome itself. Nietzsche wrote it in bursts of manic inspiration between 1883 and 1885, each section completed in about 10 days of fevered writing. He claimed the book wasn't authored by him, but through him, that it arrived like revelation, like prophecy, like something beyond his conscious control. Later scholars would note that this intense creative period coincided almost exactly with his heartbreak over Lou Salome. Make of that what you will. The book tells the story of Zarathustra, a prophet modeled on the Persian founder of Zoroastrianism, who spends 10 years alone in the mountains and then descends to teach humanity 3 central ideas: the death of God, not as tragedy, but as liberation. God didn't die of natural causes. We killed him. We stopped needing him because we grew up, because science replaced superstition, because we can now face existence without needing cosmic comfort. But most people haven't noticed yet. They're still going through the motions of morality and meaning as if the foundations haven't crumbled beneath them. Zarathustra's job is to wake them up, to make them realize that the old sources of meaning are dead, and we need to create new ones. The Übermensch, Overman. This is probably Nietzsche's most misunderstood idea. The Übermensch isn't a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Superman. It's not about genetic superiority or dominating others. The Übermensch is the person who has overcome the need for external meaning, who creates their own values instead of borrowing them from society or religion or tradition, who says yes to life so completely that they would willingly live it exactly as it is forever. It's about self-overcoming, becoming who you actually are instead of who you were told to be. Eternal recurrence. This is the test. The question that reveals everything about how you're living. Imagine that you will live your exact life, with every moment of joy and pain and boredom and triumph and failure, again and again and again for eternity. Would you cry out in despair? Or would you say, yes, let it be this way forever? If the thought fills you with horror, you're living wrong. You're doing things out of obligation or fear or habit. You need to change your life until the prospect of eternal recurrence fills you with joy instead of dread. These ideas didn't arrive in academic language. They came as parables, poems, speeches. Zarathustra doesn't argue. He proclaims. He challenges. He mocks the comfortable and weak. The book was almost completely ignored when it was published. Nobody knew what to make of it. Too weird for academics, too philosophical for general readers, too blasphemous for anyone with religious sensibilities. Nietzsche had printed it himself, at his own expense, and it sold maybe 40 copies initially. He was devastated. He had poured his soul into this book, written it in the depths of isolation and illness and heartbreak, and the world responded with a collective shrug. But he kept going, because that's what Nietzsche did. When life knocked him down, he used the impact to bounce higher. For the next few years, he wrote book after book, each one expanding on and clarifying the ideas in Zarathustra. Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, attacked the fundamental assumptions of moral philosophy. On the Genealogy of Morals, 1887, traced the historical origins of our moral concepts, showing how good and evil evolved from very different, very human sources. By 1888, his final productive year, he was writing with almost supernatural speed. The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, all completed in months. Ecce Homo is particularly fascinating. It's Nietzsche's intellectual autobiography, where he looks back on his life and work. The chapter titles alone reveal his mindset. why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books, why I am a destiny. You can read this as manic grandiosity. Or you can read it as a man who finally stopped apologizing for his brilliance, who decided that false modesty was just another lie society tells itself to keep everyone mediocre. Either way, by late 1888, Nietzsche was working himself to death. The headaches were constant, his eyesight was failing, he could barely eat or sleep, but he wrote and wrote and wrote, as if he knew his time was running out. And then, on January 3rd, 1889, in Turin, he saw the horse. The collapse was sudden and total. One day he was functioning. The next he was gone, lost in delusions of grandeur, convinced he was Dionysus and Christ, incapable of coherent thought. His mother came to collect him and brought him back to Germany. For the next 11 years, Nietzsche lived as a shell. He didn't write, barely spoke, spent his days staring into space while his mother and later his sister cared for him. He died on August 25th, 1900, from what was likely the final stages of the syphilis he'd contracted decades earlier. And here's the cruel irony. Just as Nietzsche was losing his mind, the world was finally discovering his work. Let's talk about the most famous thing Nietzsche never actually said. At least not the way people think he said it. God is dead isn't a triumphant declaration. It's not an attack. It's a diagnosis. The full quote from The Gay Science goes like this: God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Notice the tone? This isn't celebration. It's horror. Awe. A recognition of just how massive this change is and how unprepared we are for it. Nietzsche saw what most of his contemporaries refused to acknowledge. Western civilization was losing its Christian foundations. Science had explained away miracles. Historical criticism had demolished the literal truth of Scripture. Philosophy had undercut the rational arguments for God's existence. But people were still living as if Christianity were true, still appealing to Christian morality, compassion, humility, self-sacrifice, without believing in the Christian God who supposedly commanded those values. This is what Nietzsche meant by the death of God. Not that an actual deity had ceased to exist, he never believed in one to begin with, but that the Christian framework that had organized Western life for 2,000 years was collapsing. And the collapse wasn't leading to nihilism by accident. Christianity itself, Nietzsche argued, created nihilism. Here's how. Christianity teaches that this world doesn't matter. It's a temporary testing ground. Real life, meaningful life, happens after death in heaven. Your suffering here is meaningful only because it earns you eternal reward later. But if you stop believing in heaven, in afterlife, in cosmic justice, what happens? Suddenly this life, the only life we actually have, seems meaningless. We've been taught for centuries that earthly existence is worthless, except as preparation for something else. But that something else doesn't exist. That's nihilism. The sense that nothing matters because the thing that was supposed to make it matter God, heaven, eternal soul, was a beautiful lie. Most people respond to this realization in one of two ways. They either pretend they still believe, go through the motions, attend church without conviction, appeal to values without being able to explain where those values come from, or they collapse into despair. If there's no God, no ultimate meaning, no cosmic justice, then why bother with anything? Why not just pursue pleasure and avoid pain until death? Nietzsche saw both responses as pathetic. The first, pretending to believe, is cowardice. You know the truth, but you're too afraid to face it. The second, despair and hedonism, is weakness. You need someone else, even a divine someone, to tell you what your life means before you can create meaning. Nietzsche wanted a third option, creation. If God is dead, if there's no pre-existing meaning, then we're free to create our own, free to decide what matters and what doesn't, free to craft our own values instead of inheriting them. But that freedom is terrifying. It means responsibility. It means we can't blame our failures on God's plan or original sin or fate. It means we're alone in deciding what kind of life is worth living. Most people, Nietzsche believed, aren't strong enough for that freedom. They'll always need someone to tell them what to believe, what to value, how to live. But for those rare few who can handle it, who can face existence without the safety net of divine meaning, the death of God is liberation. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are. Stop pretending. Stop borrowing someone else's values. Stop living by rules you don't actually believe in. Create yourself. Build your own meaning. Say yes to your life so completely that you'd willingly repeat it forever. Easy to say, brutally hard to actually do. Which brings us to the next uncomfortable idea. This is where Nietzsche gets really dangerous, where his ideas can be twisted into justifications for cruelty if you're not careful, where honest engagement with his work requires confronting some deeply uncomfortable truths about morality itself. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traces the historical development of our moral concepts. He argues that good and evil haven't always meant what we think they mean. Originally, Nietzsche claims good meant noble, powerful, healthy, life-affirming, and bad simply meant common, weak, low. This was master morality, the morality of people who were strong enough to define their own values. They called themselves good because they were powerful, creative, life-affirming. They called the weak bad the way you might call spoiled food bad, as a statement of fact, not a moral condemnation. Then something changed. The weak, those who couldn't compete with the strong on terms of strength, invented a new morality, a slave morality. They flipped the script. Now good meant humble, meek, self-sacrificing, compassionate, and evil meant proud, powerful, self-affirming. Christianity, Nietzsche argued, was the ultimate triumph of slave morality. It took everything the weak couldn't achieve, strength, pride, worldly success, and declared it sinful. It took everything the weak could claim, humility, suffering, meekness, and declared it virtuous. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Turn the other cheek. These aren't just nice teachings, they're a complete reversal of values. They make weakness into virtue and strength into vice. Now, before you hear this as Nietzsche endorsing cruelty or oppression, stop That's not what he's saying. He's not saying the strong should dominate the weak. He's saying that we should stop pretending that weakness is morally superior to strength, that we should stop using morality as a weapon to drag down anyone who excels. Think about it. How often do we call someone arrogant when we really mean confident? How often do we demand humility from people who have genuine reasons to be proud? How often do we treat ambition and self-assertion as moral flaws? That's slave morality talking. The resentment of those who can't achieve greatness against those who can. Ressentiment, Nietzsche called it. The French word for resentment, but specifically the kind that's impotent, that can't strike back directly. So it invents moral categories to condemn from a safe distance. You can't beat the strong person in a fair fight. So you declare fighting unfair. You declare strength itself immoral. You create a morality where the weak are automatically good and the strong are automatically evil. And then, here's the genius of it, you make them accept your values. You convince the strong that they should be humble, compassionate, self-sacrificing. You turn their strength against themselves. This is what Nietzsche saw in Christianity. Not a religion of love, though it called itself that, but a weapon wielded by the weak against the strong. But again, and this is crucial, he's not saying we should abandon compassion or care for the suffering. He's saying we should examine where our values come from and whether we actually believe them or just inherited them. Do you value humility because you genuinely think it's good? Or because you've been taught that people who stand out are arrogant? Do you practice compassion because it enriches your life? Or because you've been taught that self-interest is selfish? These are dangerous questions. Questions that can easily be misused to justify cruelty. But they're also necessary questions. Because as long as we don't examine where our values come from, we're just puppets dancing to music we didn't choose. If you've heard of only one Nietzsche concept besides God is dead, it's probably this one, the will to power. And it's probably been completely misunderstood. The will to power isn't about dominating others. It's not about being powerful in the social or political sense. It's not about the strong crushing the weak. It's deeper than that, more fundamental. Nietzsche argued that the basic drive in all living things isn't survival, as Darwin suggested, and it's not pleasure, as Freud would later argue. It's the will to power, the drive to grow, to overcome obstacles, to become more than you currently are. Everything alive is constantly trying to expand, to master its environment, to become stronger. Not necessarily bigger or more dominant over others, but more capable, more complete, more fully itself. A plant growing towards sunlight is expressing will to power. An artist mastering their craft is expressing will to power. A philosopher challenging accepted ideas is expressing will to power. The opposite of the will to power isn't weakness, it's stagnation, comfort, the acceptance of good enough. This is why Nietzsche had such contempt for people who sought happiness as their primary goal. Happiness, for him, was a sign that you'd stopped growing. You were satisfied with what you are instead of striving to become more. Man does not strive for happiness, he wrote. Only the Englishman does that. Nietzsche's shade was international. The will to power explains why humans don't just seek comfort. Why we take on unnecessary challenges, create art, explore dangerous ideas, push ourselves past what's comfortable or safe. It's not about power over others, though that can be one expression of it. It's about power over yourself, the ability to overcome your current limitations and become something greater. This is what he meant by self-overcoming. The human being is not a fixed thing. We're not born with a nature that we then express. We create ourselves through constant struggle against our own limitations. The person who seeks comfort, who avoids challenge, who stays in their lane, they're denying the will to power. They're choosing stagnation over growth, and Nietzsche saw stagnation as a kind of death. Worse than death, actually, because a life that never strives to become more is a life that never really lived. But here's where it gets tricky. Here's where his philosophy can be twisted into something ugly. If the will to power is the fundamental drive, and if self-overcoming is the highest good, then what about people who can't overcome themselves? What about people who are genuinely limited by circumstance or ability? Nietzsche didn't have a good answer for this. Or rather, he had an answer that makes us deeply uncomfortable. Not everyone can become the Übermensch. Most people will remain trapped in slave morality, in comfort-seeking, in borrowed values. And that's okay? Necessary even? He talks about the order of rank, the idea that some people are just more capable of self-overcoming than others, that we shouldn't pretend everyone is equal in their capacity for greatness. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy gets weaponized by people with ugly agendas. They hear order of rank, and they think racial hierarchy. They hear will to power, and they think military domination. But that's not what he meant. He was talking about spiritual and philosophical capacity, not genetic or racial superiority. He despised anti-Semitism, one of many reasons he broke with Wagner. He thought German nationalism was pathetic. His order of rank was about individuals who had overcome themselves versus individuals who remained comfortable, about those who created their own values versus those who borrowed them. Still uncomfortable? Good, it should be, because Nietzsche isn't trying to make you comfortable. He's trying to wake you up, trying to make you ask, am I living my life according to values I've actually chosen, or am I just following the script? And if the script isn't making you stronger, why are you still following it? Of all Nietzsche's ideas, this might be the most beautiful and the most difficult. Amor fati, love of fate. Not acceptance, not resignation, not everything happens for a reason. Love. Active, joyful, complete love. For your life exactly as it is. Nietzsche wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendacity in the face of what is necessary, but love it." This is connected to his concept of eternal recurrence that we touched on earlier. The test is simple but brutal. Would you be willing to live your exact life, with every moment of joy and suffering and boredom and failure again and again for eternity? If the answer is God no, then you're living wrong. You're doing things you don't actually value. You're wasting time on obligations you don't believe in. You're suffering in ways that don't make you stronger. But if you can say, yes, let this exact life repeat forever, then you've achieved amor fati. This doesn't mean you stop trying to change things. It means you stop resenting the struggle. You stop wishing your circumstances were different. You embrace the fight itself as part of what makes your life yours. For Nietzsche, this wasn't just philosophy, it was survival strategy. Remember, He spent most of his adult life in chronic pain. His eyesight failed. His friendships collapsed. His work was ignored. He died isolated and insane. If anyone had reason to curse their fate, it was Nietzsche. But instead of cursing it, he used it. Every headache became an opportunity to test his endurance. Every rejection became fuel for his philosophy. Every moment of isolation became space for thinking thoughts no one else dared to think. He transformed his suffering into strength by loving it. Not despite the pain, but because the pain was necessary to create who he became. This is amor fati, not optimism, which Nietzsche considered stupid. The best of all possible worlds was Voltaire's punchline, not a serious philosophy. And not pessimism, which Nietzsche saw as life denial, Schopenhauer's cowardice. Amor fati is beyond optimism and pessimism. It's saying, this is my life. These are my circumstances. I can't change the past or control the future, but I can choose how I relate to what is. I can resent it and make myself miserable, or I can love it and transform it into fuel. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Isn't about surviving trauma. It's about actively using trauma as a forge to temper yourself. Most people hear this and think it sounds harsh. Unforgiving. Like Nietzsche's telling you to just deal with it and stop complaining. But that's not quite right. He's not saying don't change things. He's saying stop wishing you had a different past or different circumstances. Those are fixed. They're part of you now. The only question is, will you let them define you as a victim? Or will you use them to become something greater than you would have been without them? This is why Nietzsche had so much contempt for Christianity's promise of cosmic justice, of afterlife rewards, of heaven compensating for earthly suffering. That promise teaches people to endure suffering by fantasizing about escape. It makes suffering bearable by making it temporary and meaningful. But for Nietzsche, that's a lie that weakens you. Because as long as you're waiting for heaven, you're not fully present in your actual life. You're not transforming your suffering into strength. You're just enduring it while dreaming of rescue. Amor fati says, there is no rescue coming. This is your life. These conditions are permanent. Now what? The answer separates the strong from the weak. The strong say, then I will make this suffering meaningful by using it to overcome myself. The weak say, this is unfair. Someone should fix this. I shouldn't have to deal with this. And they're right. It is unfair. You shouldn't have to deal with it. But you do have to deal with it. Because fairness is a comforting lie we tell ourselves. Life isn't fair. Suffering isn't distributed justly. The universe doesn't care about you. You can spend your whole life raging against that fact. Or you can accept it and ask, given that this is true, how do I want to live? That's amor fati, not acceptance of suffering, but transformation of suffering into art. We've mentioned this idea several times, but let's sit with it fully, because the eternal recurrence might be Nietzsche's most psychologically powerful concept, and also his strangest. The idea is simple. Imagine that every moment of your life will recur infinitely, not just once or twice, but endless times. Every joy, every pain, every boring Tuesday, every heartbreak, every triumph, every moment of grinding boredom, all of it forever in exactly the same order. Would you be filled with despair, or would you feel joy? Nietzsche presents this thought experiment in The Gay Science. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'? Here's the thing. Nietzsche never clearly states whether he believes eternal recurrence is literally true, some cosmological property of the universe, or just a thought experiment, a psychological test. And it doesn't matter. The power of the idea isn't in its literal truth. It's in what it reveals about how you're living. If the thought of repeating your life forever fills you with horror, you're living wrong. You're doing things you don't actually value. You're spending time with people you don't actually like. You're following a path you don't actually believe in. The eternal recurrence is a mirror. It shows you whether you're living with integrity, whether your actions match your values, or whether you're just going through motions dictated by habit, obligation, and fear. But there's a deeper layer here, one that connects to amor fati and the death of God. Christianity promises escape. No matter how bad things get, this life is temporary. You'll die and go to heaven, if you're good, or hell, if you're bad. But either way, this particular configuration of suffering ends. The eternal recurrence removes that escape hatch. If this life repeats forever, then there's no after. There's no heaven waiting to compensate for earthly suffering. There's only this, again and again. For someone raised on Christian hope, this is horror. It's hell, actually. Not fire and brimstone, but the eternal repetition of the exact life you're already living. But for Nietzsche, it's liberation. Because if there's no heaven, no escape, no true world waiting after death, then this world, this life, right now, becomes infinitely precious. Every moment matters, not because it's being judged by God, but because it's all you have. It's all you'll ever have. Even if it repeats forever, there's nothing else. This is why the eternal recurrence is the ultimate test of amor fati. If you truly love your fate, then eternal recurrence shouldn't terrify you. It should fill you with joy, because you'd be getting your beloved life infinitely. But most of us fail this test. Most of us are living lives we'd be horrified to repeat. Working jobs we hate. Maintaining relationships that drain us. Following rules we don't believe in. Waiting for someday when things will be better. The eternal recurrence says, there is no someday. There is only now, forever. So either change your life until the thought of repeating it fills you with joy, or accept that you're wasting the only existence you have. That's Nietzsche's gift. Not comfort, but clarity. The brutal, liberating clarity that comes from stripping away every comforting illusion until only truth remains. We need to talk about Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Because no story about Nietzsche is complete. without understanding how his legacy was hijacked by the person who should have protected it. Elizabeth was Friedrich's younger sister. She'd been devoted to him their entire lives, or so she claimed. In reality, she was possessive, manipulative, and held views that would have disgusted her brother if he'd been capable of defending himself. We already saw how she sabotaged his relationship with Lou Salome. But that was just the beginning. In 1885, Elizabeth married Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semite who believed Germans needed to create a pure colony somewhere free from Jewish influence. They moved to Paraguay to establish Nueva Germania, a utopian colony that would preserve Aryan racial purity. Nietzsche was horrified. He despised anti-Semitism. He'd broken with Wagner partly over Wagner's anti-Jewish views. He saw racism as yet another slave morality, a way for mediocre people to feel superior without actually achieving anything. He wrote to Elizabeth condemning the venture. But she went anyway. The colony was a disaster. Förster was a terrible administrator. The colonists couldn't farm in tropical conditions. The whole thing collapsed, and in 1889, Förster committed suicide. Elizabeth returned to Germany just as her brother was losing his mind in Basel, and she saw an opportunity. With Friedrich incapacitated, unable to speak or write coherently, Elizabeth took control of his literary estate. She became the gatekeeper of his work, the interpreter of his philosophy, the manager of his legacy. And she systematically distorted everything. She published collections of his notes as if they were finished works. She edited his letters to remove criticism of her and Förster. She emphasized passages that could be read as supporting German nationalism and downplayed his attacks on anti-Semitism. Most infamously, she compiled a book called The Will to Power from Nietzsche's unpublished notes, arranging them to make it seem like he had a systematic philosophy supporting racial hierarchy and German supremacy. This was a complete fabrication. The Will to Power as a book was never Nietzsche's plan. The notes were fragments, many of them ideas he'd already rejected in his published works. But Elizabeth presented them as his final philosophy. When the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, they loved what Elizabeth had done with her brother's work. She welcomed their attention. She gave Hitler a tour of the Nietzsche archive. She accepted honors from the Nazi regime. The philosopher who despised anti-Semitism, who hated German nationalism, who attacked the very concept of racial purity, he became a Nazi icon because his sister sold him out. Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900. He never saw the horrors of the 20th century. He never saw how his ideas would be twisted. But his silence, imposed by mental collapse, allowed Elizabeth to speak for him. And she said everything he would have despised. Scholars have spent decades untangling the real Nietzsche from Elizabeth's version, reading his actual published works, his letters, his notes, demonstrating that his philosophy was about individual self-overcoming, not racial domination, about creating values, not imposing them by force. But the damage was done. For many people, Nietzsche will always be associated with Nazism, with cruelty, with the justification of evil. All because his sister loved power more than truth. All because the person closest to him was also his greatest betrayer. There's a lesson here, though it's a bitter one. Your legacy depends on who survives you, on who tells your story, on whether the people who claim to know you best are actually telling the truth about you. Nietzsche would have appreciated the irony. The philosopher who warned about the will to power, about how the weak use morality as a weapon, about how truth gets twisted by those with agendas, he became the victim of exactly what he warned against. Let's clear up some persistent myths. Because if you're going to reject Nietzsche's ideas, you should at least reject what he actually said, not what people claim he said. Myth number 1. Nietzsche was a nihilist. No. Nietzsche diagnosed nihilism as the inevitable result of the death of God, but he didn't embrace it. His entire philosophy was about overcoming nihilism by creating new values. Nihilism says nothing matters. Nietzsche says nothing matters inherently, but you can make things matter by choosing to value them. That's not nihilism. That's existentialism. Before existentialism had a name. Myth number 2. Nietzsche hated compassion and love. Also no, he hated fake compassion, the kind that's really just pity disguised as virtue, the kind that keeps people weak instead of helping them become stronger. He hated love that's really just possessiveness or neediness or fear of being alone. But genuine compassion, the kind that helps someone become who they're capable of being, Nietzsche valued that. He just thought it was rare. Myth number 3. Nietzsche wanted the strong to dominate the weak. This is the most persistent and most wrong interpretation. Nietzsche's strong and weak aren't about physical or political power. They're about spiritual capacity. The strong are those who can create their own values, who can face existence without needing God or cosmic justice or borrowed morality. The weak are those who need external validation, who can't bear uncertainty, who demand that life be fair. You can be physically weak and spiritually strong. You can be politically powerless and philosophically powerful. Nietzsche's contempt was for spiritual weakness masquerading as moral virtue, for people who use their limitations as weapons against those who exceed them. Myth number 4. Nietzsche went insane because his philosophy was wrong, evil drove him mad. His mental collapse was almost certainly due to physical illness, likely tertiary syphilis, possibly a brain tumor, maybe some other neurological condition. It wasn't divine punishment for blasphemy. It wasn't his philosophy eating his brain. It was just bad luck. The kind of meaningless suffering Nietzsche spent his whole life trying to show us how to face. The irony is that his breakdown is actually consistent with his philosophy. Amor fati doesn't promise to prevent suffering. It just gives you a framework for dealing with it. Myth number 5. Nietzsche was a conservative, reactionary proto-fascist. He was none of these things. He hated German nationalism. He despised anti-Semitism. He thought contemporary politics was mostly beneath him. His conservatism was limited to thinking that not everyone is equally capable of philosophical insight, which isn't really a political position at all. The Nazis appropriated him. Conservatives sometimes quote him. But Nietzsche would have found all of them tedious. He was too radical to be conservative, too individualist to be socialist, too contemptuous of mass movements to be anything we'd recognize as a modern political position. So what was he? Nietzsche was Nietzsche. He doesn't fit in our boxes. That's part of what makes him dangerous and valuable. You can't domesticate his ideas. You can't make them safe. You can't turn them into a political platform or a self-help system or a religious alternative. All you can do is take them seriously. Think about what they mean. Test them against your own life. And that brings us to the real question. What do we actually learn from Nietzsche? What can we take from his life and work that makes us better, stronger, more fully ourselves. Let's get practical. Let's talk about how Nietzsche's toxic ideas actually work when applied to real life. Lesson 1. Question your inherited values. Most of what you believe about right and wrong, success and failure, good and bad, you didn't choose it. You absorbed it from parents, teachers, society, religion. Nietzsche isn't saying those values are wrong. He's saying you've never actually examined them. You've never asked, do I genuinely believe this, or do I just believe it because everyone else does? Try this. Pick one thing you should do, something you feel obligated to do but don't actually want to do. Now ask, who told you that you should do this? What values does it serve? Are those your values or someone else's values that you accepted without questioning? If they're genuinely your values, if you choose them consciously, understanding both their costs and their benefits, great. Keep them. But if you're just following them out of habit or fear or guilt, drop them. That's slave morality. That's living someone else's life. Lesson 2. Suffering can be fuel. Nietzsche's life was objectively terrible in many ways. Chronic pain, failed relationships, professional rejection, mental collapse. But he used all of it. Every headache became an opportunity to test his endurance. Every rejection became material for his philosophy. Every moment of isolation became space for thinking. This doesn't mean you should seek out suffering, and it doesn't mean all suffering is valuable, but it does mean that the suffering that comes anyway, the unavoidable kind, can be transformed. You can let it crush you, or you can use it to forge something stronger than you would have been without it. The difference is choice. Do you see yourself as a victim of circumstance, or as someone who uses circumstances, even terrible ones, as raw material for creation? Lesson 3. Create, don't inherit your meaning. If God is dead, metaphorically at least, if the old sources of meaning don't work anymore, then you need to create new sources. This is terrifying. It means you're responsible for your own life in a way that's much harder than just following a script. But it's also liberating, because you're no longer bound by meanings that don't fit you. You're no longer forced to pursue goals that don't actually matter to you. Try this. Imagine you're designing a video game, and your life is the main character. What would make that character's journey meaningful? What challenges would be worth facing? What achievements would feel satisfying? Now ask, is your actual life aligned with that? Or are you pursuing meanings borrowed from people who aren't you? Lesson 4. The Eternal Recurrence Test. We've talked about this, but it bears repeating because it's so practically useful. Regularly ask yourself, if I had to live today exactly as I lived it, forever, would I be okay with that? If the answer is no, change something. Don't wait. Don't make excuses. Change it. If you're staying in a relationship that drains you because you're afraid of being alone, the eternal recurrence calls bullshit. If you're working a job you hate because it's practical or responsible, the eternal recurrence asks, for how many eternities are you willing to sacrifice what you actually want? This isn't permission to be reckless or irresponsible. It's a reminder that you're trading your life, your actual finite existence, for whatever you're doing with your time. Make sure the trade is worth it. Lesson 5. Amor fati. This is the hardest lesson and the most valuable. Love your fate. Not just the good parts. Not just the parts that make sense or feel fair or turned out well. All of it. The failures that taught you, the rejections that redirected you, the suffering that forged you. This doesn't mean you stop trying to change things. It means you stop resenting the past. You stop wishing you had different circumstances. Because resentment is poison. It makes you weak. It keeps you focused on what was instead of what could be. Amor Fati says, "This is my life. These are my scars. These are my victories and my defeats. I wouldn't change any of it, because changing any of it would make me someone else. And I choose to be me." Lesson 6. Be willing to be disliked. Nietzsche was hated in his time, misunderstood, isolated. He could have softened his ideas, made them more palatable, pursued popularity instead of truth. He didn't, because he valued truth more than acceptance. You don't have to be as extreme as Nietzsche, but you do need to accept that living authentically, by values you've actually chosen, will make some people uncomfortable. If everyone likes you, you're probably not living honestly. You're probably performing a version of yourself that fits what others expect. The question is their approval worth the cost of your authenticity? Lesson 7. Self-overcoming is never finished. The Übermensch isn't a destination. It's a direction. You never arrive at self-overcoming. You just keep overcoming yourself, again and again. Every time you master a challenge, a new one appears. Every time you think you've figured yourself out, you discover new depths to explore. This is good news. It means you're never stuck. You're never too old or too damaged or too far gone to continue growing. As long as you're alive, you can overcome yourself. You can become something more than you currently are. And so, we come to the end, though not really an ending, because Nietzsche's ideas don't resolve. They don't offer closure. They circle back, always, to the same uncomfortable questions. Who are you when you strip away everything you inherited? What do you actually value, not what you've been told to value? Are you living a life you'd willingly repeat forever? Can you say yes to your fate, all of it, without resentment? These questions don't have final answers. They're meant to be lived with, wrestled with, returned to again and again. This is Nietzsche's gift. Not answers, but better questions. Not comfort, but clarity. Not salvation, but transformation. He showed us how the death of God could be liberation instead of catastrophe. How suffering could be fuel instead of curse. How weakness often disguises itself as virtue. How we create the very meanings we claim to discover. He paid a terrible price for his insights, isolation, illness, madness, betrayal even after death. But he wouldn't have wanted us to pity him. Pity is what the weak give to the weak, its condescension disguised as compassion. Nietzsche would want us to learn from him, to use his life and work as raw material for our own self-overcoming. Because that's what all great philosophy is. Not a doctrine to follow, but a provocation to think. Not a destination, but a road. Not a solution, but a challenge. As you drift towards sleep, let these questions linger. What comfortable lies are you telling yourself? What inherited values have you never questioned? What suffering are you resisting instead of using? What would it mean to truly love your fate? You don't need to answer tonight, or tomorrow, or ever, completely. The questions themselves are enough. They're the first step in becoming who you actually are instead of who you were told to be. And that, finally, is what Nietzsche offers us. Not a map to follow, but permission to forge our own path. Not rules to obey, but freedom to create our own. Not the promise that life will be easy or fair or comfortable, but the possibility that it could be yours. Truly, authentically, dangerously yours. Sleep well, nightlings, and when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world a little differently, a little more honestly, a little more dangerously. Perhaps you'll be ready to overcome yourself. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I made playlists of our most popular videos and themes like Most Boring and Calm playlist or Deepest Life Lessons playlist. Check the links in the description below. Sweet dreams, nightlings. And may you wake tomorrow with a clearer mind, a calmer heart, and the courage to ask one good question. See you next time.